It would be best for us to punctuate this conversation on you telling me exactly who the three Nephites are, where they are, and what they're doing. Hello, Saints. My name is Jeff. I am a pastor in Utah, exploring everything I can about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this is part 2 of my reaction to reading through 3rd Nephi out of the Book of Mormon. This is my friend Greg Matsen from CWIC Media.
Glad to be back.
From what I understand, 3rd Nephi is incredibly important to a lot of Latter-day Saints. And there's a lot of central, foundational Latter-day Saint teaching derived from 3rd Nephi. So you're going to help me make sure I'm understanding it properly, I'm not skipping over anything, and that I'm just handling it with the care that is due.
Yeah, a lot of doctrine, and I think really very personal to Latter-day Saints.
Sounds good. All right, so let's dive in. As far as just setting the stage is concerned, 3rd Nephi is essentially beginning, so right around the time that Jesus is to be born. There's the appearance of a new star, but there were some, even after seeing the signs, they still didn't have faith. And there was an uproar, and there was division. This is really leading up to the time when Christ is ministering, again, on the other side of the ocean, and is about to be crucified. So this is the state of things. So this is when essentially terrible things happen in the land. Awful things. It coincides with the death of Jesus. Is that correct?
Correct.
They're in darkness, and a voice speaks. We know it to be the voice of Jesus. They didn't know. He clearly states that the reason these things happened was because of the iniquities of the people. And in verse 13, he's saying, so for those of you who are left, you are less wicked, but I'm still calling you to repentance. So then verse 8, Jesus descends from heaven, clothed in a white robe. Behold, I am Jesus Christ, whom the prophets testified, shall come into the world. And behold, I am the light and the life of the world, and I have drunk out of the bitter cup which the Father hath given me, and have glorified the Father in taking upon me the sins of the world, in the which I have suffered the will of the Father in all things from the beginning. So here we have Jesus announcing who he is, and as we go on and read, the lights are coming on for them. So we get into chapter 12 now, and Jesus calls 12 disciples. And he essentially goes into what I recognize as the Sermon on the Mount. The only couple spots that I wanted to touch on, it would be interesting to hear how a Latter-day Saint might understand what's being stated here. In chapter 12, verse 48, therefore I would that ye should be perfect, even as I, or your Father who is in heaven, is perfect. Can you help me understand, what does a Latter-day Saint understand that to mean?
We'll get a little scholarly here.
Okay.
The underlying Greek, for example, in Matthew 5:48, is teleos. So the idea, in fact, it's a word that's thrown around a lot today, is telos, right? What's the telos? It means the meaning or the purpose of where you're going. Teleos it's to complete, to be fulfilled.
Yes.
Right? And so for us, looking at this, as far as being perfect, this would be you're fulfilling your course, right? You're becoming complete at this point. For us also, this would be a temple reference, right? It's you've gone through the whole process and you are complete. You've fulfilled everything. So perfection is not something that we can gain in terms of our agency, our choices.
Yep.
Right? Of course, we get help from the Savior in that case, but we can become perfect as God is perfect. In other words, we can be where he's at, in a sense, because of his help, because of his grace.
Okay. And would it be fair to say that this would be tied to the desire for entering the celestial kingdom and the desire to be in a position of the possibility of ongoing exaltation?
Yes, it would. It's definitely talking about, for us, exaltation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And I only say that because everything that you said up to this point, there would be a lot of agreement that when we read this, even in the New Testament, about being perfect, we understand that to mean that completion concept is only attainable through the cleansing of what separates us from him and causes an incompleteness, which is our sin. And the whole idea of being perfect, just as your Father is perfect, is essentially allowing the cleansing of our sin to take place so that we are able to be in his holy presence. And that perfection is all about reconciled presence and reconciled relationship with him.
And we'd be close to that.
Okay.
But when you say allow, for us, it would be an effort on our side.
Yes.
So you might think works on our side a little bit, but it's an effort on our side to repent.
Yes.
And to become.
Yes.
In that case.
Okay. And even in my world, that word allow would have some debate attached to it.
Okay.
Because for the smaller percentage than people realize of more Reformed Calvinist people who put a strong emphasis on election and predestination, they would say, oh, you don't allow God to do anything.
It's even put further out
Yes,
there.
he is the one who has chosen. So you're simply receiving what he is doing. He doesn't need your permission, if you will.
Got it.
Now, that is not the vast majority of mainstream Christianity, but there's a segment in my world that would become a conversation. So then to that point, he does go on in this chapter, and this is another portion of the Book of Mormon that a lot of Latter-day Saints have pointed to as either important or even just sentimentally meaningful to them. This much did the Father command me that I should tell unto them, that other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Okay, how do Latter-day Saints understand that passage? Because he's clearly echoing what is stated in John chapter 10, verse 10.
So we would look at that as there's a scattering of his people. And so Jesus in John is talking about other covenant members of his people that he needs to visit and that he needs to talk to and that he needs to go probably through these rituals and covenants with, as he did with them, we would say at the at the Sermon on the Mount, etc. And that there are others. So this wouldn't be the only other sheep, right? With the Nephites and Lamanites here, there would have been others. He's going to say that he needs to go and visit them also.
Sure.
So what we have then, for us again, looking at the Bible, we would say, well, we have this Book of Mormon. Well, where there's one, there's maybe another, right? And so there would have been other people, others scattered from Israel that he would have visited. We just don't know who they are, and we don't have the records.
Yeah. And we believe when he's saying that in John chapter 10, he's actually speaking to the Pharisees who had this very narrow view of those who were cutting it. And he's like, guys, you don't get it. Like, you're not the best sheep. You're not the cleanest sheep. I have more. And he's actually alluding to not just the less Pharisaical or law-abiding Israelite, but also Gentiles, which it would just be mind-boggling to them.
Sure.
Now, how does he accomplish bringing that good news to the people in the rest of the world? The other sheep not just being people of Israel, but being even Gentiles, people who have no ethnic tie to Israel. And that is in the New Testament age through all of us who are spirit-filled going into the uttermost parts of the world and making disciples.
Yeah, so we would agree with that also, but we would say that he was also being specific to those here in the Book of Mormon and to others.
And is there the belief within the Latter-day Saint thinking that there were other appearances of Jesus to other people groups, maybe not in the Americas?
Yes.
And that there's potentially other scriptures that have been since lost that were specific to that people?
Potentially.
Potentially, okay. I'm now going to point to a section or a chapter that I've had the most emotional response from Latter-day Saints. And it is in chapter 17, when Jesus begins to heal all kinds of people from all kinds of infirmities, and he also blesses children. Is this just a coincidence that I've had so many people point to chapter 17? Or would you say this is a pretty widely regarded chapter where Jesus is doing this healing and showing compassion?
No, I think definitely it is. I mean, of course, going back to the wounds and touching the wounds is probably a little bit more impactful, but it's kind of like in the Bible, right? In the New Testament, if you only had Matthew, and then later someone brought to you Luke, it would be incredible for you, right? I mean, there's a little bit different nuance, there's some little changes, but it's another witness, right? And so for us, that's the way the Book of Mormon is. And so to see him do this with the people of the Nephites here at Bountiful, where what he's done already in the old world, it's like this huge witness to us.
A compassionate, more personified in a sense, presentation of Jesus, I'm finding to be deeply meaningful to Latter-day Saints, even with those who are deeply impacted by the Chosen. I've had a lot of Latter-day Saints tell me that prior to the Chosen, they regarded Jesus as a very stoic individual who is making very clear the importance of staying on track. You got to get this right. Like, you really need to stay in line here. So there's something that seems to be really meaningful to seeing this side of Jesus that is compassionate, that is inviting, that is approachable.
Sure.
I think that's another observation that I think I've made. So as we get into chapter 18 in 3rd Nephi, now he is instituting the sacrament. One thing that I thought was pretty interesting here, an observation I made, is he positions the bread representing his body a little bit differently than we see in the New Testament. Where in the New Testament he says, this is my body that I have given for you, or my body that was broken. In chapter 18, he says, and this ye do in remembrance of my body, which I have shown unto you. So I've had a lot of conversations with Latter-day Saints because of, the downplaying of the cross, or we don't use a cross. Latter-day Saints saying, well, we really want to put a focus on the resurrection. I would say, here is your scriptural basis for that. That the sacrament seems to be presented to the Nephites as, this is my body, my resurrected body that I have shown to you. So the sacrament does go beyond crucifixion, even to resurrection. That was just an observation I made, and I've actually been thinking,
that's really interesting.
Latter-day Saints, here's your scriptural basis for this. It doesn't have to just be, we'd rather focus on the resurrection. Jesus seems to present the sacrament more focused on his glorified state as opposed to his broken state.
Yeah, and I think, that's a very good point. I think also, again, it is the audience he's talking to, right? That he has shown this to them. I mean, obviously, when he has the Last Supper in the upper room, he hasn't gone through that yet. He doesn't have the wounds at that time. He's going to get them later.
He is in the process of breaking. He's about to go to Gethsemane.
That's right. Yeah. He's about to go to Gethsemane. He's in that process, but he hasn't gone through that yet. So in that way, it's the timing of this with a resurrected body and with the wounds in him. For me, as I partake of the sacrament, right, then it's a reminder of two things, right? It is the resurrection, but it's also the wounds. Because when he says, I've shown you my body, it is a wounded body that he is showing them. So I don't think it takes away fully from the cross in that sense, right?
Yeah.
They go up and they feel the wounds and all. And then of course, the wine or water, he's going to refer to wine in here, is to us would be the blood actually of the Gethsemane.
Okay. Oh, interesting. I think that in our respective faith groups, we would probably assert that we within our faith persuasion have a more balanced view, right? Latter-day Saints saying, you Protestants put so much emphasis on the cross. What about resurrection? Whereas we would say, hey, you can't ignore the cross. You put so much emphasis on the resurrection, right? And I think the reality is, I am learning, Latter-day Saints do focus on the death of Jesus. Like you said, touching of the wounds, some of those other things. And the reality is, we put an enormous emphasis on the resurrection of Jesus in Protestant Christianity. How we contextualize that and tie it to Scripture is where there's going to be differences.
And how the talking points are brought up, right, between the faiths. And how we've talked about. Another point on that is, during the sacrament and listening to the sacrament prayers, it is all about remember me, right? Remember him. And so what typically would be happening in the minds of most people, most Latter-day Saints during the sacrament, is they're remembering Gethsemane and the cross.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. That would be, and I'm not saying not the resurrection too, but they're remembering what he did.
Right. So it is a inadvertent, I'm not saying this is done on purpose, but it is not accurate for a Latter-day Saint to say, we don't want to focus on his suffering and his death, we want to focus on the resurrection. It might be more accurate to say, we focus on both, but we really do want to always point to resurrection.
Yeah, I think that because when it comes down to it, when you do have to because you don't have to choose between the two, but in a way, sometimes you do. And in other words, behind us here, we've got a cross, right?
Yeah.
So we wouldn't use the cross because we would say, well, ultimately, the cross and Gethsemane are done for our triumph, for our resurrection.
Yes.
And that ultimately is the hope that we have.
Yeah. And I think what we would say is victory has been won. Colossians chapter 2, on the cross. Our debt has been paid. And as we live in this fallen state still, anticipating resurrection, the full consummation of our salvation and resurrection, we still grapple with sin. So we're constantly pleading the blood of the cross, not in order to maintain our salvation because we're already saved, nor is it because if we sin, we're going to go to hell, so we need to plead the blood so that we don't go to hell. But it's because we see our only hope in this sin-filled world is to rally around the cross. So Calvary is so quintessentially important for us to remember. I am fallen. I need him. That victory on the cross has to be my rallying point so that I'm not living in the defeat of the flesh. All right, so these teachings that Jesus is bringing in this sermon at the temple, something starts to happen over the next few chapters, and that is sort of forward-looking or future-seeing, future-proclaiming statements, a lot of which are tied to or quoting the book of Isaiah, and talking about what the future will hold for this land, for Israel, for a New Jerusalem. And then in chapter 25, you have this parallel proclamation that you can all see in Malachi chapter 4, which from our standpoint, we would look at as the day of the Lord, what it looks like when the Lord shows up on the scene to bring things into balance, which can be very terrifying in some sense, which a lot of times you'll have things like the earth shaking and fire and the moon disappearing, stars falling from the sky, but also very exciting for those who are of his people, because there's redemption and there is rescue and some of those other things. And that's why you'll even have at the end of chapter 25 this statement where it says, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. And I understand that has importance in a Latter-day Saint view as well.
Yeah, so again, I mean, I'm beating a dead horse here, but the whole time we're talking about covenants, and here for us, this is a reference, a scriptural reference that we use all the time for temple work. And so when we talk about the children turning their hearts to the fathers, it's us doing temple work for those that have passed on.
Okay.
And for the fathers that have turned their hearts to us, it would have been, they're the ones that are writing, they're the ones that are leaving us the scripture, they're the ones that are prophesying for us and what's happening. So it's kind of bringing both things together here in a covenant type of a situation.
Sure. And even as that passage concludes, there's an or else attached to it, or in the King James, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse, which then gets into more eschatological utterances in chapter 26, and it's expounding on the whole idea of judgment. It says, and even unto the great and last day, when all people and all kindreds and all nations and tongues shall stand before God to be judged of their works, whether they be good or whether they be evil. If they be good, the resurrection of the everlasting life, and if they be evil, to the resurrection of damnation, being on a parallel that one on the one hand and the other on the other hand, according to the mercy and the justice and the holiness which is in Christ, who is before the world began. That resurrection unto damnation. Obviously, in my context, that is a resurrection where you are then consigned to a place separated from God's presence forever, what we would call hell. It's not necessarily pitchforks and flames, but it is a place of torment, being that you are not in the presence of God, which is what we were made for. What is a Latter-day Saint view of damnation?
So I think there's two things to that. One is, damnation is the same word that you get with like the dam of a reservoir, for example, right? It's stopping the water, right? So dam, D-A-M-N, actually also means to stop, to not be able to, in a Latter-day Saint context, this fits perfectly, not to be able to continue to progress. So a damnation would be, or a curse even that you're receiving, would be something where it's saying you are not being able to progress and or, for example, progressing toward being in the presence of God, or progressing in who you're becoming, to become like Him, right? So damnation is not necessarily a state of permanence,
Okay.
right? It could be, I suppose, but it's not necessarily that. It's saying, if I sin, then in a sense I'm damned, because I am held off from the Spirit. I'm held off from I'm separating myself from God, right? And that would be damnation in one sense. Whereas if I'm following the commandments, if I'm trying to be who I'm supposed to be, and I'm following Christ, then I am able to progress and move forward.
And so again, so many similarities, and yet just a little bit of a nuance there at the end, where we're talking about presence of God, being held back from the presence of God, whereas we would say, and that is our greatest reward. That is eternally satisfying, and what eternity will be is a mystery to all, but it's going to be exciting, adventurous, all fulfilling. He's going to wipe every tear from our eye because we are in God's presence, which is what we are meant to be in. But that doesn't, for us, we don't at that point need progression. We were talking earlier about the whole idea of completeness. And another word that's tied to that in the Hebrew is shalom. It's wholeness and completeness. That when we are in God's presence, we are complete, we are at peace, we are whole. There is no need for any further progression because God's presence is our all in all. So I think, again, from a presence standpoint, I think there's agreement when it comes to a optimal existence being one in which you continue to progress. That's where I think mainstream Christianity would say we don't embrace that.
Yeah, and for us, the ability to continue to progress is only if you are in the presence of God.
Okay.
Right? In other words, you're in the celestial kingdom. You are at His throne. You are with Him. If you are in another place, in another kingdom where you are still saved, so to speak, and you are still given glory to some degree, and happiness and joy beyond probably anything we can even imagine still.
Sure.
You're not in the presence of the Father.
And that is so important because a lot of Latter-day Saints will get upset when I allude to the fact that to those of us on the outside, it looks like a works-based salvation. And Latter-day Saints don't like to hear that because, no, we're only saved by Christ, right? But what you just said right there is why it does appear to us. Because what is our goal? What is our objective? If we're saying salvation is the presence of God, and from a Latter-day Saint view, you're saying, and you will be withheld from the presence of God unless you fulfill saving ordinances, that's where to us it looks like. So I have to do things to gain access to God's presence, when for us, salvation and heaven is God's presence.
Right, and that is a difference. And again, sometimes salvation in the Scriptures for us is the universal salvation, so to speak, right? Of being resurrected and having a glory, etc. And sometimes salvation in the Scriptures, depending on who's speaking of it, is exaltation that you're focused on. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is focused on exaltation because it is the ideal.
Which is the highest place in the celestial kingdom.
Highest place in the celestial kingdom, and it's what we are taught to reach for, right? It is the ideal that we should all move toward.
Right.
So oftentimes when even for ourselves, we think of salvation, we probably move toward exaltation, right, when we're thinking about that. But there are two different ways to look at that. As far as the works for the temple, that's not even enough, right? Because the works, the ordinances of the temple are only effective if you're adhering to the covenants that you make there. And so for us, again, I think we talked about this last time, it's not an ordinance path that we talk about, it's a covenant path where we're binding ourselves to God, binding ourselves to Christ. And by making that covenant and then keeping it, that helps us to become. And so that doctrine of becoming for Latter-day Saints is everything. For us, we would not be able to stand the presence of God if we had not progressed to a certain position, to a certain point.
Yeah, and we would say it is only Christ's righteousness that makes us presentable and able to be in the presence of God. And there's nothing we can do to augment that. that Jesus is enough, is what we would say. It's, in fact, that's a phrase that we hear us utter
I've heard
time and
that
time
many
again.
times. Yeah, I just want to put a nuance on that. So we would say the same thing, because in the sense that you cannot do any of that, and you cannot progress without Christ. And that is both him making the payment for your sin and dying for you,
Right.
and you learning to have faith in what he did, having that faith to be able to lean on what I would say is the covenant, right? That happens in Gethsemane on the cross.
Yeah. We talked in a video we did on your channel on sort of an epicenter of diverging understandings of how we view the Garden of Eden differently.
Yes.
Here we are, I think, at another point that we could say there's some pretty important distinctions here. And it's tied to what is heaven, what is paradise, what is it that we're all desiring, versus what is damnation, what is hell, what is a less than existence. And I think the difference in understanding there, again, sort of gets back to some of these core distinctions that exist between how you view judgment, damnation, condemnation, all those other things. And as we then move out of sort of these utterances about this future time, about judgment, Jesus then starts to provide some instruction. And I will say that chapter 27 of 3rd Nephi has thus far been, hands down, my favorite chapter in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
Without question. I think that it is probably one of the most concentrated chapters in the Book of Mormon, that not all of it, but most of it so very much consistently aligns with what's at the heart of biblical
What was your favorite thing in this
Christianity.
chapter?
It was verses 14 through 27, and there's a lot going on there. But just as he's stating that, Jesus talking, me being lifted up on the cross, it's about me testifying to the heart of the Father. It's very much at the heart of what we hold to in mainstream Christianity, that there is a day of judgment coming, but that I'm lifted up for the salvation of men, just like the serpent was raised in the wilderness. You see that in John chapter 3. Talking about enduring to the end. That's a big part of the conversation we have, is those who are truly saved will endure to the end. And every single epistle that you read is a call by the epistle writer, whether it's Paul or Peter or James or John, saying, keep going, keep your feet moving. You've got to, there's a perseverance that is required here in order for us to recognize that the race needs to be finished. We're talking about the holiness of God. That is one of the most misunderstood and undervalued attributes of God that is really at the heart of this entire salvation opportunity we have. It always goes back
What does holiness
to the
mean
holiness of God.
to you?
The holiness of God is his utter, complete perfection. There's no shifting shadow in him. And this is where, from a mainstream Christian standpoint, we don't believe that there is anything outside of God that qualifies him. He is the qualifier. So there's no such thing as an idea of good outside of God. God is the standard of goodness. There's not a standard of beauty outside of God. He is the standard of beauty. There's not a standard of
Truth.
goodness, truth, love that he perfectly fits under. He is the perfect standard of those things. So when we see God in his holiness and being the sum of all that we desire, and the sum of all that we need, it is not because he perfectly fulfills those things that are outside of him, but because he is those things. So it really gets more to the relational aspect of who God is, when we do see him probably slightly more transcendent than Latter-day Saints might view him.
Perhaps. Yeah, and that's opening up another can of worms.
Yeah. And there was a lot more in here. There were just so many teachings, especially verses 14 through 27, that I just so very much aligned with. But as I make that statement, I'm recognizing a very consistent pattern. I've recognized it before, but I'm seeing it here, and that is where I get super excited about anything I read in the Book of Mormon. It's where there is a direct tie, echo, in my case, what seems like a reference to the Bible. Anytime something is proclaimed that I can't connect to the Bible, that is either outside of the Bible or might even seem inconsistent with the Bible, that's where
Yeah, that makes
I push
sense.
away. So as we get into the latter few chapters here, in 3rd Nephi, I think that it would be best for us to punctuate this conversation on you telling me exactly who the 3 Nephites are, where they are, and what they're doing. I say that jokingly, of course, because there's this really fascinating development that takes place with the 12 disciples that he's established, and that is 9 who are promised to live out their life through natural ways and to die in natural ways and to eventually inherit the kingdom, but 3 who are promised essentially translation, like they are not going to taste death.
Is that the same word you use, translation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because that's our word too.
We believe that there were Old Testament individuals who Elijah experienced that, and there's one other one that
Moses?
I can't think of right now. No, we believe
For us, Moses.
See, Moses died, and his bones are referenced in the Old Testament.
Okay.
So we believe that he actually died. In fact, that was part of his curse of losing his temper, and God saying you won't enter the Promised Land. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that, though. That the belief is that 3 of the original Nephite disciples are still living on earth.
Yes.
Okay.
And another one you probably don't know is John.
This clarified that for me.
Right.
My good friend Kurt Frankum, he asked me at one point, he's like, "You guys believe Apostle John is still alive?" I'm like, "I have no idea what you're talking about right now." It was a lost there, and this is why. Because in 3rd Nephi it says, "Just as John, or my beloved disciple, desired." And then you have something that this gets super nuanced, super in the weeds, but in verses 13 through 17, he's echoing the language of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 about them going to a third heaven, experiencing things that they can't. It's not lawful to write, or that words can't express, which is very much tied to like a 1st century Merkabah mysticism of Jewish practice, which is a whole can of worms, which we won't get into. As we then sort of finish the book in 3rd Nephi with a lot of language about those who accept will be blessed, those who reject will be cursed, and that parlays into sort of the continuing narrative in 4th Nephi, which is only 1 chapter, which was a bit of a relief for me after going through all of this in 3rd Nephi. I'm like, okay, what's in 4th Nephi?
And covers like 300 years.
Yeah, 320 years. And it really sets the stage, and we don't really need to go into it, but it sets the stage of, richness and prosperity and distraction and division sort of takes over the land, and there's another division again with Nephites and Lamanites, and it seems to set the stage for what are going to be the final books in the Book of Mormon.
And this is the climax. From here, it just all goes downhill.
I mean, that's a Book of Mormon for you, right?
Yeah.
Like, as soon as you got it figured out, you're going to mess it all up. So yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to just process through this with me. I know it was a lot of information. I know a lot of this was sort of on the spot.
Very fun. Love doing it.
Yeah. So you got to check out CWIC Media, Greg Matsen. He covers a wide range of topics. In fact, one of the reasons why I wanted Greg to do this video with me is because he has done videos reacting to reading the Book of Mormon. So this fit hand in glove. Also, he's a friend, which I very much appreciate, and relationship is a context in which we want to strive to have conversations
Absolutely.
like this, and friendship. So I appreciate your patience with me, your charity. And not only do you need to check out his channel, but check out other videos on this channel if you haven't already. I've done other books in the Book of Mormon. You can like this video, you can subscribe, support me on Patreon if you want. You don't have to though, just keep coming back. More conversations like this. Also, a special thanks to Jordan Valley Church in West Jordan for allowing us to record this video here. They were incredibly accommodating and really appreciate that. So, until next time, I'll see you later, Saints.